Okay, so welcome back. As we continue to move on through ecology, there's a lot more to talk about with the flow of energy and the way that organisms interact with their environment and with one another. So when we talk about ecology, it's important to understand that we're talking about different ecosystems. So an ecosystem consists of all the organisms living in an area as well as the abiotic factors. So not only are you talking about the living things, the biotic factors, so that's what this is talking about, the biotic factors. You're also talking about the abiotic factors with which they interact. So you're talking about not only the organisms and how they interact with each other, the predator eats the prey and the decomposers break this stuff down, but you're also talking about the non-living things. You're talking about the water and the soil and even the temperature of the area, that specific ecosystem. So a single introduced species can have dramatic effects on both the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. And that's where we really look at human impact and how we kind of mess things up when we introduce these invasive species that really throw a monkey wrench in the balance of an ecosystem when we introduce even a single species. So here they give you different examples of interactions within an ecosystem. So ecosystems range from microcosm. They say something like your belly button is its own ecosystem because it has so many microbes within it and it has its own kind of balance to it. And even if you look at space under a fallen log, that is a little ecosystem, to even looking at a large ecosystem that involves a giant lake or involves an entire island. Those are ecosystems, and ecosystems can be very tiny, they can be very large. So regardless of an ecosystem size, its dynamics involve two main processes. You have energy flow and you have chemical cycling. So a lot of times we talk about energy flow, but you also want to understand that chemical cycling is also very important. That's where you hear a lot about in environmental science and sustainability. The chemical cycling is also very important in our ecosystem. So energy flows through ecosystems while chemicals cycle within the ecosystem. So energy is going to flow a certain direction and then eventually make its way back where chemicals are constantly cycling through, or we hope so, as long as we don't throw them off. So ecologists study the transformation of energy and matter in ecosystems and map the movements of chemical elements. Laws of physics and chemistry and even geology, earth science, all of these things are going to apply to ecosystems. The first law of thermodynamics is often brought up when we talk about ecology because it states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, can only be transferred and transformed. So it doesn't just apply to physics and chemistry, it actually applies to biology as well. And when you talk about the life sciences, there's so much that involves life sciences. It really takes understanding all the sciences in order, really chemistry for the most part, but even physics and earth science also play a major role in understanding biology. So if anyone ever tells you that biology is the simplest one, well, it really, it may seem so because chemistry is so intangible and physics is so math based, but biology is very complex because it really incorporates energy, everything. So energy enters an ecosystem as solar radiation from where else? The sun is conserved and is lost from organisms as heat. So the second law of thermodynamics states that every exchange of energy increases the entropy of the universe. In an ecosystem, energy conversions are not completely efficient. Some energy is always lost as heat, and that's where we talk about the entropy of the universe. So the law of conservation of mass states that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Chemical elements are continually recycled within the ecosystem, and in those systems, they're open systems absorbing energy and mass and releasing heat and waste products, and this is constantly going on. But energy is never created or destroyed. It's just transferred, so it can make its way back. If a nutrient's outputs from an ecosystem exceed its inputs, the nutrients will limit production. So if that ecosystem loses a certain chemical or certain nutrients, well, then you're going to decrease the carrying capacity of that ecosystem for specific organisms that rely on those specific nutrients. If nitrogen is a major part of that ecosystem, and it will be, and nitrogen is depleted and is not restored, well, that's where you're going to see that there's going to be less plants, because plants are going to need nitrogen. If there's less plants, then there's going to be less primary consumers. If there's less primary consumers, there's going to be less secondary consumers, and that's where we see that the not only is energy flow so important, but also the chemical cycling involved as well. So autotrophs are going to build molecules themselves using photosynthesis, or in some cases we talk about chemosynthesis as an energy source. The big one we talk about is photosynthesis, but there are organisms, there are autotrophs. Right? When we talk about autotrophs versus heterotrophs, autotrophs are the ones that are making their own energy. Heterotrophs are the ones that have to consume things or eat things in order to get energy. Well, we always talk about autotrophs as plants, plants, plants. Well, those are the ones that are going to use photosynthesis, but there are organisms that do not use photosynthesis, and they are still considered autotrophs. They still they still create their own energy. They do this through chemosynthesis, making energy through the breakdown of chemicals, certain chemicals. So heterotrophs depend on the biosynthesis, synthetic output of other organisms, and then energy and nutrients are going to pass along from the primary producers to the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, quaternary consumers, all the way up through the food web. You have detritivores, which are going to get their energy from detritus, which is non-living organic matter. We often just refer to them as our decomposers. Prokaryotes, which are our simple cells. They are not eukaryotic cells like we are made up of. They're made up of these very simple prokaryotic cells that don't even have really a nucleus, or they don't have these membrane-bound organelles. And fungi are the main detritivores. They are going to break down that detritus. They're going to be the decomposers that are going to add energy back to, or they're going to add energy back to the ecosystem by breaking down the things that other things aren't going to break down. So decomposition really connects all the trophic levels. I talked about this last week, how we can't fit that into the energy pyramid anywhere necessarily, because it fits on all levels. They will break down their primary consumers, they break down primary producers, it could break down secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. It is going to break down any dead organic matter, and anything that was once living is going to be organic matter. All right, we are made up of organic matter. Plants, animals, they're made up of organic matter. So you have different types of decomposers. You have bacteria, you have fungi. When we look at the different types of organisms, you see that not only is it energy flow, we talked about food webs last week, and this could be, you could look at this as a food web really, but it also involves chemical cycling as well. So in most ecosystems, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs. So those autotrophs are going to convert that energy, and it is going to make it usable for the heterotrophs. And in some ecosystems, you have those chemoautotrophs as the primary producers that are not using sunlight as the energy source for the ecosystem. But we mainly talk about the photosynthetic organisms that are going to produce energy, and sets the spending limit for an ecosystem's energy budget, we say. So the amount of solar radiation reaching Earth's surface limits the photosynthetic output of ecosystems. Only a small fraction of solar energy actually strikes the organisms, and even less is of a usable wavelength. So if you've talked about wavelengths in the past, you understand that the wavelengths that are used, the colors that we see, those are very limited in the big scope of the different wavelengths that are reaching us. So in marine and freshwater ecosystems, both light and nutrients control primary production. Depth of light penetration affects primary production in the photic zone of an ocean or a lake. We mainly look at this in ocean. So there are areas where light, if you go into the ocean and you go deep enough, right, the ocean can be thousands of meters deep. Well, if you go once you pass a certain level, light is not reaching that far down, and in order for organisms to survive down there, and we have found out that they do survive down there, they are using a different source of energy. They are not using sun, they are using the chemicals that are there. So more than light nutrients limit primary production in most oceans and lakes. So as big as oceans may be, and as many things there's as many nutrients as there might be, um, we see that it's going to be limited by the amount of energy that's available as well as the amount of nutrients. So even though there might be a lot, it is a very vast amount of space, and it's going to limit the amount of nutrients that are available to the area, to the organism. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients that are most often limiting factors in the marine production or in the marine environment. So upwelling of nutrient-rich waters in parts of the ocean contributes to regions of high primary production. The addition of large amounts of nutrients to lakes has a wide range of ecological impacts. In some areas, sewage runoff has caused eutrophication of lakes, and nutrient inputs from sewage promotes the growth of primary producers. And you have these booms of algae, all right, or an algae boom, which really throws off the whole ecosystem. So detritivores are going to use up dissolved oxygen, break down dead producers, and you're going to have a loss of oxygen, which is going to lead to the other organisms, the fish, the other animals in that ecosystem to die. So as much as you think, oh, you know what, you want to promote the growth of primary producers, well, by promoting this growth of primary producers, you can end up having a loss of oxygen, and it's going to lead to the death of organisms in that. So in lakes, you have phosphorus, which is going to limit cyanobacterial growth more often than nitrogen is. So phosphorus is going to be that, we call it our limiting factor. And this has led to the use of phosphate-free detergents. So as we go green, the detergents that we use should be phosphate free in order to um, uh, keep the ecosystems at balance. So soil nutrients can limit primary production in terrestrial ecosystems. Nitrogen, most common in terrestrial ecosystems as well. So you need nitrogen, and we're going to talk more about this as we move forward, about how you need nitrogen as well as phosphorus in our terrestrial ecosystems. Various adaptations help plants access limiting nutrients from soil. Some plants form mutualistic relationships or mutualism with nitrogen fixing bacteria. So very important to know that, well, in any ecosystem, excuse me, in any ecosystem, there needs to be plants that are called nitrogen fixers. They have this nitrogen fixing bacteria, and the biggest one we like to talk about are any type of legume. All right, that's beans. They are going to have these nodules, and in the nodules, they really allow this nitrogen fixing bacteria to live there, and that's that mutualistic relationship where bacteria have a place to live, and they are going to supply the plants with nitrogen. But not only do they supply those plants with nitrogen, they really supply the soil with nitrogen. And by supplying the soil with nitrogen, now you have more nitrogen for the ecosystem. Because although we breathe in a lot of nitrogen, that is not a usable form of nitrogen. In order for us to get nitrogen, because remember, nitrogen is in all of our proteins, it's important for protein synthesis. In order to for us to have that nitrogen, well, we cannot just breathe it in. All right, we have to get it from eating, and in order for that to happen, we have to eat things that are nitrogen rich. And in order for those things to get nitrogen, they have to get it somewhere along the way. It came from nitrogen fixing bacteria, came from those nitrogen fixing plants like legumes. So many plants form mutualisms with mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi supply plants with phosphorus and other limiting elements. Roots have root hairs that increase surface area, and many plants release enzymes that are going to increase the availability of limiting nutrients as well. When we talk about secondary production of an ecosystem, it's the amount of chemical energy in food converted to new biomass during a given period of time. Now, when we like to calculate production efficiency, you're going to see that it's set up as an equation where production efficiency is going to be equal to the net secondary production times 100% divided by the assimilation of primary production. So when a caterpillar feeds on a leaf, only about a 1/6 of the leaf's energy is used for secondary production. So you see that you're going to have this caterpillar feeding on a leaf. Well, if there's 200 joules of energy, and you can think of joules as just a unit for energy. Well, if there's 200 joules of energy, well, about 100 is going to go to feces, and you're going to have about 33 joules go to growth, which is our secondary production, and 67 are going to go to cellular respiration. So this is where we see that as you move up through the ecosystem, there is less and less available energy. We like to say that only about 10% makes it to the next level. So if I have just theoretically a million joules of energy from the sun hitting the earth, only about a very small fraction will make it to the producers. Once that small fraction makes it to the producers, we see that as we move up, only 10% is going to go from one level to the next. So you have a million, and then you end up with about 10,000. We'll say this is just, in theory, it's not a perfect 10% every time, but let's just say it's typically very close to 10% in a terrestrial ecosystem. So if you have 10,000 joules available in your primary producers, well, only about 1,000 joules are going to be available for the secondary consumers, and then you're only going to have about 100 joules available for the tertiary consumers. And as you go up, there's less and less energy in each level. So birds and mammals have efficiencies in the range of 1 to 3% because of the high cost of endothermy, meaning that we are going to create our own heat, right? We don't rely on the outside, the environment for our temperature levels like amphibians do, like fish do. They are ectotherms, but we are endotherms. We are going to regulate our own temperature, and that costs a lot of energy. We have to use a lot of energy to do that. Fish have efficiencies are around 10% because they are ectotherms, and then insects and microorganisms have a little bit more at 40% or more. Trophic efficiency is the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next, and we usually say it's about 10%, but there's really a range of 5 to 20%. That's really about it for talking about this. When we talk about aquatic ecosystems, sometimes they're a little bit different, where you see that phytoplankton or their producers are consumed so quickly that they are going to be outweighed by primary consumers. So it's a little bit different than terrestrial ecosystems, but you can read more about that in the textbook, and just keep these things in mind as we move forward and continue to talk about ecology.